Selected in 1985 by the late Mrs. Coretta Scott King to edit and publish the papers of her late husband, Stanford University historian Dr. Clayborne Carson has devoted most of his professional life to the study of Martin Luther King Jr. and the improvements and the movements he inspired. In 2005, the King Papers Project became part of the Martin Luther King Jr. Research and Education Institute at Stanford University, with Dr. Carson serving as its founding director. Dr. Carson has been a member of Stanford's Department of History since receiving his doctorate from UCLA in 1975. He has also served as visiting professor or visiting fellow at a number of prestigious universities. Among the many awards and honors Dr. Carson has received, the honorary degree he received in 2007 from Morehouse College had special meaning because it made him part of the community that includes Martin Luther King Jr. and Martin Luther King Sr. Dr. Carson also served as senior advisor for the award-winning public television series on the civil rights movement, Eyes on the Prize. In addition, he has participated in the making of numerous other documentaries, including Freedom on My Mind, which was nominated for an Oscar, and a musical play which has been performed around the world. Dr. Carson has lectured throughout the United States and abroad, and has appeared on a number of national radio and television shows, and has delivered lectures on behalf of the Organization of American Historians Distinguished Lectureship Program. In 2009, Dr. Carson collaborated with the Roma Design Group of San Francisco to create the winning proposal in an international competition to design the King National Memorial in Washington, D.C., and he has served as an advisor to the King National Memorial Foundation. Dr. Carson is married to Susan Ann Carson. They live in Palo Alto, California, and have two children and 3 grandchildren. Would you please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Clayborne Carson.
Good morning to all of you. It's a real pleasure to be here. This is one of my favorite places to be because of all the natural beauty of Utah. I grew up in New Mexico, so I'm used to the desert and its wonderful pleasures. I recall bringing my family here for. We came together to tour the national parks. Spent 3 weeks hiking in all of them, and spent probably about half that time here in Utah. So this is a great place to come back to. I should mention that the Provost Webb's description of me, sometimes it's a little bit out of date. I now have 4 grandchildren rather than 3. That Isaac would be all upset to be left out of that. And it's also, I think, this is a wonderful time to be talking about Martin Luther King. We're just past the King holiday. We're approaching 50 years since his death. I've taken as a theme this year, where do we go from here? And it's taken from the last book that he wrote. And I think of that book as being very instructive because he wrote the book in 1967, after the passage of major civil rights legislation. So the book is really a guide to where do we go in that era after the civil rights revolution of the 1960s. What is left undone? I think that what he was trying to tell us is that the job was not complete. Something important did happen in the 20 years after World War II, and it happened around the world. You had a rights revolution that affected the majority of humanity. At the beginning of that period, most people on earth were not citizens of the place where they happened to live. They were subjects. They were second-class or third-class citizens, which means not citizens really at all. Most of them could not vote. Most of them were colonized. In the United States, we called it the Jim Crow system. South Africa, apartheid. At the end of that period, for the first time in history, most people were citizens. That's a tremendous accomplishment, equivalent to the accomplishment in the 19th century of ending slavery in most parts of the world. And Martin Luther King is the great symbol of that movement. But it's instructive for us to remember that after that he didn't retire. He didn't say, I've done it. I've achieved my goal. Instead, he set about trying to achieve things that he wrote about in his book, Where Do We Go From Here? And the theme of my remarks is that we haven't answered his question. We haven't decided where to go from that point on. Once we have resolved the question, and we spent the rest of the century kind of making sure that everyone got the message that you couldn't be denied citizenship rights because of reasons of racial prejudice or bigotry and all of these other barriers that were preventing people from enjoying their equal rights as citizens. And that kind of occupied the rest of the century. There were a lot of movements to expand the reach of citizenship rights. But at the end of that process, we're living in a world which I don't think very many of us would describe as a just and peaceful world. So perhaps gaining civil rights has made us complacent about something else, which I would call human rights. That because we are secure in our citizenship rights, we no longer give very much thought to the idea that for many people in the world, human rights have become increasingly important, often because they find that the nation state, which has the duty of protecting citizenship rights, is often the worst violator of those citizenship rights. And people find, what is the recourse then? So I'd like to spend some time looking at Martin Luther King's life, particularly those last 3 years after the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Because to me, those are the most interesting period of his life. Those were the most intense period of his life. And you can think of Martin Luther King, as we often do, as a person giving the I Have a Dream speech, maybe the speech at the end of the Selma to Montgomery March. And I would refer to these, as he does at the end of his life in Memphis, as those mountaintop moments. As you'll recall, he gives a wonderful speech. We call it the mountaintop speech. And I think that's a misnomer, kind of like the way the I Have a Dream speech is the part that he did not intend to give. It was made up on the spot. If you look back at his prepared remarks for what he was supposed to say in Washington, he was limited to only 5 minutes. So he wrote a speech. There's no mention of "I have a dream" in it. All of that was extemporaneous when he decided to go over his time limit because of the response of the crowd. And in the same way, the mountaintop speech. He mentions the mountaintop at the very end. But the speech is actually, and I invite you to go and read it online, it's actually a review of his life. And he begins it by giving a panorama of history, and he speculates about what it would have been like to have lived at all these great periods in the ancient world, the Renaissance, other great periods of history. And he asked the question, if God gave him the chance to go and live his life in any of those periods, what would he choose? And he said, even though the present period, the world is all messed up, violence all around. This is, again, in 1968, at the height of the Vietnam War. That seems like that the cry for freedom throughout the world is often not being heard. But he said, in spite of that, if I just had a few years to live, I would choose to come back and live in that 20-year stretch following World War II. And it was because, he said, it's during that time that we face this question of what are we going to do when people throughout the world are saying we want to be free. And that cry could be heard, and he mentioned South Africa, and he mentioned the cry throughout Africa and Asia and many of the places in the world. And he asked the question, how do we respond to that? And his answer was one that allowed us to look back at his life. He said he went back through those mountaintop experiences. And there were really only a few. He lived most of his life in the valleys. Certainly the great triumph in Montgomery. And what we find when even at the mountaintop he understands how close he came to failure. If you go back and read about the Montgomery bus boycott, you would find that he didn't have anything to do with starting it. He just happened to be living in the same place that Rosa Parks was living. And Rosa Parks and Montgomery women organized a boycott to protest the treatment they were receiving on Montgomery buses, passed out 50,000 leaflets, got people to stay off the buses on December 5th, 1955. And that afternoon, after the boycott was 99% successful, they have a meeting and decide, no, we have to have a spokesperson for this movement, especially if it's going to go on for the second day. And Martin Luther King was unexpectedly selected to lead. He had only arrived in Montgomery a year before. So there were many other much more experienced leaders, E.D. Nixon, Joanne Robinson, a number of other people who were probably much more equipped and qualified to lead a bus boycott than Martin Luther King. But there was something that they liked about this new, young, 26-year-old, very articulate, just received his doctorate. And they said, why don't we select him? And I think perhaps some of them just recognized that whoever led this boycott was probably going to end up in jail. And it was easier, they figured, for this young guy who had just had his first child. And Martin Luther King was actually somewhat reluctant. He had been asked to lead the local chapter of the NAACP, and he declined. He said, look, I've got a baby coming, and he wasn't prepared yet. But there was something about that moment that said, yes, I need to accept this invitation. And that night, he gives a great speech, makes it up in about 10 or 15 minutes. And again, I invite you to go and read it. Because what he does is something that he does on his mountaintop moments. Is he takes this bus boycott, which is at that point not even about segregation of buses. It's about better treatment under segregation. That's all they're asking for. And he gives a speech in which he says, if we are wrong, the Constitution of the United States is wrong. If we are wrong, the Sermon on the Mount is wrong. If we are wrong, the Declaration of Independence is wrong. In other words, he was taking that modest goal of the movement and linking it to something much larger than that. These transcendent values about justice and equality. And he said at the end of the speech, when the history books of the future are written, they'll have to say there lived a great people right here in Montgomery who had the courage to stand up for their rights. Now, that's not audacious speech. You have a one-day boycott that's not even in the newspapers outside of Montgomery. And he's saying when the history books of the future are written, they'll write about Montgomery. And go to any U.S. history book today. You will find some mention of the Montgomery bus boycott. So he was right about that. But after that, he went through a period which I would call the valley, the long valley, that lasted almost 6 years, where he was not able to move forward as a leader. He gave lots of speeches, became famous. He was on the covers of news magazines, became the best-known black leader, but he was always finding himself behind the curve in terms of the movement. When the students sit in 1960, he's caught by surprise. When the Freedom Rides happen, they ask him to join the Freedom Rides. He declines. Even after the Montgomery bus boycott, he says, people will be expecting me to pull rabbits out of the hat for the rest of my life. And there's another document I ran across where he says, what is it like to reach the peak of your life at the age of 27? Where do you have to go? And he found it difficult to. And by the time of the Albany protests in 1962, he was rather depressed about it because he goes to jail, gets called into this movement in Albany, Georgia, and he's jailed along with hundreds of other people. And he comes out of it with nothing to show for it. No concessions, no gains. News reporters come up to him, Dr. King, have you failed? And he really had to face the reality that maybe he had reached his peak at 27, and there was nothing more to be done. And then his friend Fred Shuttlesworth said, come to Birmingham. He fails in Albany, and Shuttlesworth is telling him, come to Birmingham. That's like saying you failed in this small town. Now I want you to come to almost the capital of segregation. You were outmaneuvered by this small town policeman in Albany. Now I want you to face up to Bull Connor, who had a reputation even then. And Birmingham had this reputation of being Bombingham. Black people who stood up to segregation found that their homes would be bombed. Their churches would be bombed. And he makes that crucial decision to come to Birmingham. And almost like what happens in Montgomery, the Montgomery movement succeeded because of forces beyond his control. The Supreme Court intervened and integrated the buses. And it was just at the time he was about ready to give up on the bus boycott. Well, in Birmingham, he goes to jail again. And that's where he writes Letter from Birmingham Jail, one of the most wonderful documents in American history, a wonderful justification of civil disobedience. But it didn't win. Rarely does an essay win a struggle. Most people had never even read it until years later, when it became famous and probably assigned in classrooms. So he goes to jail, comes out of jail, no victory. Is this going to be a repeat of what happened in Albany? But then something, again, kind of miraculous happens. It's called the Children's Crusade. The organizers who had worked with him were saying, we've run out of people who are adults. Hundreds of them have gone to jail. The number of people who are willing to stay in jail for a long period of time, we're just out of them. But we've got these high school students. They're eager to take part in the movement. And he had to make that difficult decision of what to do. If one of these young people were injured, perhaps killed, he would have to answer for it. And he mulls over the situation and finally decides that, in a sense, they're already in jail within the segregation system. And this is a chance for them to do something to better their future. And in early May of 1963, one of the most remarkable movements in American history happens. Thousands of students flood into the streets, leave school, often without telling their parents. In fact, probably most of them without telling their parents. And they come to 16th Street Baptist Church. Smiles on their faces. You can see the films of them singing freedom songs. And what were they there for? To go to jail. With smiles on their faces. And they marched from 16th Street into the downtown area. Bull Connor is waiting with his police, arrests as many as they can. Very quickly, the jails in Birmingham fill up. The second day, more of the same. More and more students. And that's when you see the pictures of the police dogs and the fire hoses. You ever wondered why they used them? There was no other place to put thousands of students. So this was a way of trying to deter them from even going into the downtown area. Trying to frighten them off with police dogs, fire hoses. And of course, the pictures of those changed the momentum, forced the Kennedy administration to intervene and to begin preparing what became the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And that's what led King to become the king that we recognize today. Because think about it. If he had failed in Birmingham, he wouldn't have been invited to give the I Have a Dream speech. There might not have been a March on Washington. He certainly would not have received the Nobel Peace Prize the following year. He would have been a leader who reached his peak at 27 and never really realized his potential after that. But instead, he's given the prominent role of concluding the march, and he has that mountaintop experience, which, like in Montgomery, doesn't last long. Because as you remember, a few weeks later, 16th Street Baptist Church is bombed and 4 little girls are murdered there. So again, where does he go from there? The next big event is that Selma to Montgomery March. I hope some of you have seen the Selma film. See how tremendous that event. I've taken my students there. It's wonderful to have them cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and I think that that's an experience that every young person in this room should have. Of go to Selma. I'm going to be there Sunday to commemorate. I go there every year now to commemorate that march. Because symbolically what happened there, it was a march literally to freedom. On Bloody Sunday in March of 1965, 600 people marched across the bridge. They were met on the other side by police and sheriff's posse, brutally beaten at the foot of the bridge. They retreat back. Martin Luther King, who was not there because he was in Atlanta giving his Sunday sermon, rushes back. And as often in his life, he's caught unexpectedly in this movement. And he makes the decision eventually to lead the marchers from Selma to Montgomery and arrive on the steps of the Capitol. And by this time, Lyndon Johnson has decided to introduce voting rights legislation, which is passed a few months later. And that becomes the last high point in King's career. When you go back and look at his Nobel Peace Prize speech, you will see that by that time, he'd made clear that his agenda had broadened. He might have just retired. He might have just said, look, I've contributed enough. I've been threatened. By that time, he had been stabbed within an inch of his life. His life had been threatened probably more times than you can count. He had been beaten up in public. But rather than doing that, he said that my goal for the rest of my life is to deal with what I consider the 3 main problems of the world. One of them is familiar, racial oppression. It's still a fact of life that people are held back because of race and the legacy of race. Now, even after the passage of civil rights legislation, both King and Lyndon Johnson recognized that if you start at equal points, simply taking down the barrier doesn't mean that you're going to get to the finish line at the same time. That the legacy is going to weigh on every generation from that point on, unless something special was done. King called for a Bill of Rights for the disadvantaged. And he called for an all-out worldwide war on poverty. And that became the central focus of his life, leading to the Poor People's Campaign, which brought him to Memphis. But he said the other two main evils was, first of all, war, and I'm blanking on the third, actually. He talked about poverty, war, and this is early in the morning. In terms of poverty, he was going to lead this worldwide war against poverty, and he was going to try to eliminate violence and war in the world. No, this is embarrassing. But in any case, he broadened his agenda, and from that point on, his goal in life was to try to mobilize people around the issue not of civil rights, but human rights, of understanding that civil rights gains were really intended to be the kind of rights that you enjoy as a citizen of a country. But outside those rights are the rights that we refer to in the Declaration of Independence in the United States. If you recall, and I think all Americans should recall Jefferson's words, at that point there were no citizens of the United States. So of course he framed the Declaration of Independence in terms of the rights of all people as people, birthrights. And that has been a means by which black leaders from that point to the present, and people of all races, have used as a means of pointing out the hypocrisy of the United States. Because we've always had a very limited notion of who is entitled to citizenship and who is entitled to the full benefits of citizenship. Those of you who know anything about American history would realize that citizenship was initially limited to white men with property. No one else could vote. It's been a long struggle to expand that to where it is today. And that struggle was about bringing citizenship rights closer to that ideal that Jefferson hinted at in the Declaration of Independence of human rights. All men are entitled to life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. And that simply provides a framework. It's not a delineation of what are human rights. So what I would suggest is that when we go back and look at Martin Luther King's question, where do we go from here? That it's very possible that gaining citizenship rights has made us very complacent about human rights. We are secure and very happy in our rights as Americans in terms of citizenship, because those are the rights that we expect our government to protect. But there's a realm of rights which are constantly being evolved in the world. A realm of rights that belong to people as people. And it's those rights that serve as a standard for citizenship rights. As we expand, what is our ideal for what rights should be? Well, that comes when we look at Martin Luther King. It's very clear that his ideal for what rights should be is not grounded on a piece of paper, it's not grounded on a constitution, it's not grounded on law itself. It's grounded on Christianity, the Judeo-Christian tradition, the prophetic tradition, the notion of justice, And during the last part of his life, he began to see that that needed to be the guidepost in the struggles that would follow the civil rights gains of the 1960s. So when we look at Where Do We Go From Here, that wonderful book, what we see is King in that valley of doubt. Can I really accomplish this in my lifetime? He launches the Poor People's Campaign, and that's what brings him to Memphis. And he goes there because of a strike of sanitation workers. The last decision he makes in his life is to come to Memphis to speak to these sanitation workers who have gone on strike for a decent wage, the kinds of things that were not guaranteed by the Civil Rights Acts of 64 and 65. And he finds that this is a truly uphill struggle. And you can imagine, that even today, if a leader said, I'm going to bring people to Washington for an Occupy movement. And that Occupy movement is we're going to occupy the National Mall until something is done about the issue of poverty. You can kind of see why Martin Luther King was not the most popular leader at the end of his life. He was being attacked by many of the people who had once supported him. Said, why are you doing this? And at that point, I find that my admiration for him increases. Because I see him, particularly when he gives sermons during that period, talking about the need for courage, to stand up for what he believes is right and just, even when he's being criticized. So I'd like to end with a sermon that he gives just a few months before his assassination. And I think it conveys a part of Martin Luther King that might not be as familiar to you. Keep in mind that at this point, he's not at all sure that he'll live long enough to see the promised land that he talks about in his last speech. But he's speaking to a congregation of people who have known him even as a child at Ebenezer Church in Atlanta. And imagine yourself in that church on a Sunday morning. And Martin Luther King comes in and he's rather tired. He's exhausted by the struggle. He's getting criticized even from black people who are wondering why did this civil rights leader move off into these other areas, like criticizing the war, taking on the issue of poverty. And he speaks from the heart to his congregation. I say to you this morning that if you've never found something so dear and so precious to you that you will die for it, then you aren't fit to live. You may be 38 years old, as I happen to be, and one day some great opportunity stands before you and calls upon you to stand up for some great principle, some great issue, some great cause. And you refuse to do it because you are afraid. You refuse to do it because you want to live longer. You're afraid that you will lose your job, or you're afraid that you will be criticized, or that you will lose your popularity. Or you're afraid that someone will stab you or shoot at you or bomb your house. So you refuse to take the stand. Well, you may go on and live until you're 90. but you are just as dead at 38 as you would be at 90. And the cessation of breathing in your life is but the belated announcement of an earlier death of the spirit. You died when you refused to stand up for right. You died when you refused to stand up for truth. You died when you refused to stand up for justice. Don't ever think that you go by yourself. Go on to jail if necessary, but you never go alone. Take a stand for that which is right, and the world may misunderstand you and criticize you, but you never go alone. For somewhere I read that one with God is a majority. God has a way of transforming a minority into a majority. Walk with him this morning and believe in him and do what is right, and he will be with you even until the consummation of the ages. Thank you very much.